His hands were around my throat. I was 8 months pregnant, and 400 people were watching. He thought that was the end of me. It wasn't. While he was pouring a drink in his penthouse, sure I'd come crawling back, I was downloading a recording app. While his lawyers were calling me unstable on national television, I was meeting his mistress in a cafe 15 miles out of town. While he was threatening to take my daughter before she was even born, I called him. Let him talk. Let him threaten my father, my lawyer, my witnesses. Let him name a 9-year-old girl by her school and grade level. Every single word recorded. Derek Ashford was worth $2.3 billion. He had an army of lawyers, a PR machine, a board of directors, and a mother who filmed me collapsing on the floor instead of calling for help. I had a burner recording app, a best friend, and a father who quietly spent $800 million to make sure the man who tried to kill me never touched his granddaughter. Within 12 months, the penthouse was gone. The company was dissolved. The yacht, the art, the jet, all of it seized. And Derek Ashford was led out of his own building by security in front of every employee he ever screamed at. 25 years. No parole, no visitors, no legacy. He called me nothing. I made sure the whole world knew exactly what he was. The moment I stopped waiting for permission to save myself, that was the moment I was truly free. You don't need $1 billion to walk out the door. You just need one step. If this story hit you somewhere real, share it because someone in your life may need to hear it today and not know how to ask. Like, comment, and subscribe so stories like this keep reaching the people who need them most.
The first thing I remember was the steady rhythm of a machine beeping somewhere beside me. When I finally got my eyes open, the world was all soft around the edges. The lights felt too sharp, the air had a weird metallic taste, and my throat burned like I'd swallowed sand. My first thought, before I even knew where I was you. My baby, I whispered. Is my baby okay? A kind face leaned over me, then Dr. Sarah Hoffman. I knew her, but my mind was so fuzzy. Your daughter is doing just fine, Tori, she said, and I felt the cold gel of the ultrasound wand on my stomach. There you were on the screen, a perfect little curl. You, on the other hand, she said gently, have been through quite an ordeal. My hand went right to my neck, and I just flinched. The bruises already felt swollen and hot under my fingers. I kept tracing them, over and over, like I was trying to convince myself it was real. That my own husband had actually put his hands there and squeezed until my whole world just faded to black. Just then, you gave a strong little kick right against my ribs. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. You were okay. We were okay. Ms. Ashford, Dr. Hoffman's voice cut through the fog. There are a couple of detectives who need a word. Do you feel up to it? I gave a little nod, which sent a jolt of pain down my back. 2 people came in. A woman, maybe in her 50s, with piercing eyes and short gray hair, and a younger man who just looked tired, his notepad already out. The woman sat next to my bed while her partner set up a little recorder. Mrs. Ashford, she began, I'm Detective Martinez. This is Detective Brooks. We just have to ask you what went on at the Children's Cancer Gala. Her voice was all business, but there was a kindness in it. Can you tell us what you remember? The gala. My mind swam through bits and pieces. Marble floors, sparkling lights, the music, then Derek's face, contorted in a way I'd never seen. His hands on me. I had to stop and swallow, past the lump in my throat. It all happened so quickly. Take all the time you need, Detective Martinez said. I shut my eyes, and one thought just washed over me. Everyone saw. Hundreds of people. Dozens of cameras. There was no way to lie about it this time. No saying I tripped or that it was just some big misunderstanding. 17 people have already made statements. Detective Brooks, added quietly, and we have all the security footage from the venue. When I opened my eyes, the tears just came on their own. Just then the door swung open, and in rushed a man with messy salt and pepper hair. It was my dad. He stopped cold when he saw me, and his face went from pale to red to a blankness I'd never seen before. That last look was the one that truly scared me. It wasn't anger, it was something colder, something absolute. "Baby girl," he choked out. He hadn't called me that since before I married Derek, since I'd left my old self behind. "Daddy," my voice broke. He, in front of everyone. My dad came to my side and took my hand, being so careful of the IV. His hand was so warm, so real, I clung to it. "I'm going to fix this," he said. It wasn't a promise, you know. It was just a fact. The way he said it, it was as sure as the sun coming up. The two detectives just looked at each other and quietly packed up their things. "We'll be back," Detective Martinez said. "You get some rest." After they were gone, the only sound was that beeping machine. My dad just held my hand, staring at the bruises on my neck, his jaw tight. He didn't have to say a word. I could see it all in his eyes. A moment later, another person was in the doorway. It was Rebecca, my best friend from college. She was holding a tablet, her makeup all smudged. "Tori?" Her voice was shaking. "I am so sorry. I didn't want you to see this, but it's everywhere." She came over and showed me the tablet. It hit the internet 4 hours ago. Twitter, TikTok, all of it. My hands were trembling as I took it. The video was already playing. It was the security feed, black and white, but perfectly clear. I saw myself walking down the hall, one hand on my belly. Then Derek appeared behind me, his face a mask of pure rage. I watched myself turn, and even though there was no sound, I remembered his every word. His hands came up, his fingers dug into my neck, and he just squeezed. I saw my own eyes go wide, my mouth open with no sound. My pregnant belly was right there between us. He just squeezed harder. I could see my own hands scratching at his, my legs giving out. Then two waiters rushed in and pulled him off. He let go, but his face wasn't sorry, just furious. The video stopped. Underneath a number glowed. 42 million views. I just dropped the tablet. I couldn't stop shaking. "There's more," Becca said softly. His lawyers put out a statement. She swiped to a news story. There was Derek's attorney on our front steps, surrounded by microphones. "Mr. Ashford deeply regrets the altercation," the man read. "His wife has been suffering from severe emotional instability due to her pregnancy. He said Derek was just trying to get our family the help it needed." My dad's hand tightened on mine. Then they showed a clip of Margaret, Derek's mother, in a fancy suit and pearls, looking so dignified. "Tori has been so difficult lately," she said, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes. "We've all been so worried about her." They were already building their story, you see. I was the crazy pregnant wife, the problem he was trying to manage. Just then, my phone on the nightstand started buzzing. A private number. It rang 4 times 5. My dad reached for it, but I grabbed it first. I hit the answer button. "Come home, Victoria." It was Derek. His voice was that calm, measured one he used to charm everyone. "We'll forget this happened. I'll tell the press it was a misunderstanding. We will move on." My free hand went to my throat, to the very real, undeniable bruises. "No," I whispered. "I'm sorry, what was that?" His voice got sharp. I said, "No." There was just silence, then a short, cold laugh. "You don't say no to me, Victoria. I own you. I own that baby. You come home, or I will destroy you." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone, and I looked at my father, and at my best friend. Your grandpa and my lawyer were both looking at me with the exact same expression. a mix of worry and a rage that was simmering just under the surface. I told them, I am not going back. And my voice, honey, it was steady. Something in me had cracked open when Derek said those words. I own you. The old me shattered, and someone new stood in her place. I was never going back. Your grandpa leaned over and kissed my forehead, so gently, and promised me I wouldn't have to. After they left, I was alone for the first time since I'd woken up. I picked up my phone, stared at it for a moment, and then I searched for a call recording app. I downloaded one and made sure it worked. I didn't ask anyone, didn't tell a soul. I just did it, quietly, because I knew he would call again. He always had to have the last word to prove he was in charge. But next time, I'd be ready. Next time, his own words would become my weapon. I put my phone on this table next to the bed and rested both hands on my stomach. I felt you kick, just a little flutter, and I whispered, we are going to be okay. I had no idea how, but I knew we would be. The heart monitor beeped along steadily. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all day finally started to fall, tapping against the window. And somewhere in the city, in a penthouse that cost more than most people earn in 10 lifetimes, Derek Ashford was pouring a drink, sure I'd come crawling back. He had no clue what was about to happen. You see, 6 hours before the ambulance, 6 hours before the security tapes, 6 hours before 42 million people watched my husband try to kill me on the news, I was just standing in my closet trying to figure out what to wear. It was for the Children's Cancer Gala, one of the biggest charity nights of the year. I'd planned on going for months, back when I still pretended to care, back when I was still me. Are you ready yet? Derek's voice cut through the air. We're going to be late. I pulled out a navy blue maternity gown. It was a simple dress with long sleeves and a modest neckline. It was safe, appropriate, and comfortable enough for a woman who was 8 months pregnant, whose back was always aching, and whose ankles were always swollen. Then Derek was standing in the doorway, already in his perfect tuxedo, one that cost more than a family's rent for a year. He glanced at the dress in my hands and his jaw went tight. That dress makes you look enormous, he said. Change. I tried to reason with him. I am 8 months pregnant, Derek. I am enormous. His eyes got cold, and the whole room seemed to get colder with them. Don't be difficult. Pick something else. I hung the navy dress back up. My hands were already shaking. I knew this mood, you see. I had learned to read the warning signs in the tightness of his eyes and the clipped tone of his voice. It was a language of danger that only I understood. I pulled out a black dress, but it was too formal. A burgundy one, too bright. A gray one, too drab. Jesus Christ, Victoria, Derek said, stepping into the closet. His cologne was sharp and expensive. It was suffocating. It's not that complicated. Just pick a dress. I flinched. I reached for a gown, the color of champagne, and held it out. It was elegant, but understated. The kind of dress that would look good in pictures without being too flashy. He looked at it for what felt like an eternity, then gave a single, sharp nod. That's better. Hurry up. He left, and I changed with trembling hands. It took me 3 attempts to pull the zipper up over my pregnant belly. When I finally looked in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman looking back at me. She had hollow eyes and a tight smile. She was a stranger, wearing my face. I used to be someone else, you know. I was Victoria Caldwell. I ran a nonprofit that helped kids get a good education. I used to run marathons. I met Derek at a fundraiser. He was so charming that night, so magnetic. He made you feel like you were the only person in the world. I should have seen that the charm was just the bait in a very clever trap. The drive to the gala was silent. Derek was on his phone, and I just watched the city lights blur past the window. I remember touching my stomach and feeling you kick. So strong, so insistent, so alive. I'm sorry, I thought. I'm so sorry. I chose him. When the car pulled up, the flashing cameras were blinding. Like a field of lightning, Derek's hand found my elbow as we stepped out onto the red carpet. To anyone watching, it probably looked protective, like a devoted husband helping his pregnant wife. Only I could feel his fingers digging into my skin, hard enough to leave marks. Smile. He whispered through gritted teeth. Look happy. So I did, and the cameras loved it. Mrs. Derek Ashford, pregnant and glowing, the perfect billionaire's wife. Tomorrow, those pictures would be everywhere. The beautiful couple, living a fairy tale life. Nobody ever takes a picture of what happens behind closed doors. Inside, the ballroom was dripping with crystal chandeliers and filled with guests in designer gowns, drinking champagne that cost more per glass than a week of groceries. Everyone who was anyone in the city was there that night. And then, Margaret Ashford emerged from the crowd, Derek's mother, draped in white silk and diamonds. Her hair was perfect, her posture was rigid, and her smile was as practiced as a politician's. She kissed the air next to my cheeks, careful not to actually touch me. Darling, you're... She paused, looking me up and down, cataloging every single flaw, glowing. The word just hung there between us, sharp as a knife. What Margaret really meant was, you're fat. You're an embarrassment. You're not good enough for my son. You're not good enough for this family. Thank you, Margaret, I said quietly. I had learned long ago that saying anything else would just be used against me. Derek's hand was still clamped on my elbow, steering me through the party, controlling my every move. I wasn't a person there. I was just a prop, an accessory. Then, across the room, I saw a friendly face, and for the first time all night, I smiled a real smile. It was Marcus Webb, an investigative journalist I'd worked with years ago. It was back when I had my own nonprofit, my own career, my own name, back when I was still Victoria Caldwell. Marcus! I waved before I could stop myself. He made his way over, his smile so warm and genuine. He was in his late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. Tori, it's been too long. How are you? I'm good. Really good. I felt Derek's grip tighten, but I ignored it. For just 1 minute, I wanted to feel like myself again. How's the journalism world? Busy, he said, working on a piece about corporate accountability. He gestured to my belly. When are you due? 6 weeks. It's a girl. Congratulations. Are you going to go back to your nonprofit work after she's born? His question lit something up inside me. It was the first time in months anyone had asked about my future, my plans. Someone was asking what Victoria Caldwell wanted. Maybe, I said, my voice full of hope. I've been thinking about it. There's so much work to be done in youth education, and I really miss... My wife is tired. Derek appeared at my elbow like a shadow. His smile was tight, the one he used when he was furious, but had an audience. Pregnancy brain. You know how it is. She doesn't know what she's saying. Actually, I started, but his hand moved from my elbow to my upper arm. His fingers pressed in, hard enough that I let out a tiny gasp that only he could hear. Excuse us, Marcus. Nice to see you. He pulled me away so fast I stumbled. My balance was already off from the pregnancy, and he didn't even slow down. I need to use the restroom, I said, once we were a little farther away. It was the only excuse I could think of. Fine. Don't take forever. I rushed through the crowd toward the hallway. The noise of the party faded behind me, my heels clicking on the cool marble floor. I pushed open the heavy door to the restroom, locked myself in a stall, and leaned against the wall. My hands were shaking again. I just stood there, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the wild pounding of my heart. I remember you started kicking inside me then, a little flurry, as if you could feel how scared I was. I just kept whispering, "It's okay. We're okay," rubbing my belly. Funny, isn't it? I hadn't believed those words myself in a long, long time. When I came out of the stall, I looked in the mirror to check myself. My makeup, my hair, everything was perfect. I was hiding a new bruise under that expensive dress, but on the outside, I looked just fine. I always did. Then I saw your Uncle Derek down the hall, and my heart just sank. He was leaning against the wall, his bow tie crooked. He'd been drinking. I could see it in the glassy look in his eyes and the way he held himself a little too stiffly. He told me I'd made him look like a fool for talking to that reporter about my work. I tried to explain he was an old friend, just making conversation, but he didn't care. He said I wasn't allowed to have opinions, to contradict him, or talk about my little charity. It wasn't about contradicting him, I said, but he cut me off. He came closer, and his shadow just swallowed me whole. He was 6'2", with 80 pounds on me, and there I was, 8 months pregnant with you. My balance was shot, my ankles were swollen. I'd never felt so tiny. He talked about how embarrassing it was, having a wife who couldn't keep her mouth shut, who acted like she was still some nobody. I remember whispering that people were right inside, that they could hear us. That's when his hand shot out and grabbed my throat. My back slammed against that cold marble wall, and it knocked the wind right out of me. The big chandelier above us just swayed, making the shadows dance. His fingers dug into my windpipe, not slowly, but all at once. There was no warning. I couldn't get any air. I remember clawing at his hands, my nails scraping his skin, my feet slipping on the polished floor. You started kicking again, so hard, like tiny little screams. His face was right there, smelling of whiskey and pure hate, his eyes just black pits. He told me I was nothing without him. He squeezed, and my vision started going blurry at the edges, like an old photograph fading. My knees gave out, but his hand held me pinned against the wall. It was such a strange thought to have, but I felt like a butterfly on a display board. I knew I was dying. In that fancy hallway, at a party, 8 months pregnant with you, in a dress he'd chosen. And his face would be the last thing I'd ever see. But then I heard voices. People running. 2 young waiters in their uniforms appeared out of nowhere. They grabbed his arms and pulled him off me so hard that he let go. I just collapsed onto the floor, gasping. The air burned coming back in. The first thing I did was put my hands on my belly, feeling for you. You kicked, thank God. You were still fighting. A crowd was forming. Someone was on the phone calling for an ambulance, and another person was taking pictures. It took 3 men to hold Derek back. He wasn't sorry, honey. Not at all. He was just furious he'd been stopped. Through my tears, I looked up and saw Margaret Ashford, Derek's mother, standing there. And the strangest thing, she had her phone out, but she was recording, not calling for help, not running to me, not stopping her son. Just filming me on the floor, filming Derek struggling. Our eyes met for a second. Her face was completely blank. It was the face of someone who'd seen it all before and learned just to watch. Then she slowly put her phone away, and everything went black. I woke up in that hospital bed. Again. The morning sun was coming through the window. A monitor was beeping next to me, a steady rhythm. My throat had this deep, bruised ache that throbbed with every heartbeat. But you were still moving, and sitting in the chair beside me was your grandfather. He was just staring at his hands. He looked awful, like he hadn't slept, his clothes all wrinkled. He seemed to have aged 10 years in one night. I whispered, "Dad?" And his head snapped up. His eyes were so red. He asked how I felt. I told him I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. I tried to smile, but even that hurt. I asked how long he'd been there, and he said all night. He wouldn't leave me alone. He handed me some water, and his hand steadied mine because I was shaking so much. The cool water felt so good on my throat. He told me the police wanted another statement, but he told them to wait, that I needed to rest. I put the cup down. I'd been drifting in and out of sleep all night, and in the clear moments, I'd been practicing this, knowing I had to do it. I looked at him and said, "Dad, I need to tell you something. This wasn't the first time." He went completely still. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, balled into fists. He looked like a spring wound so tight it was about to snap. He just asked, "What do you mean?" I looked right at him, my hands steady for the first time in years. It was strange, but finally letting go of that secret made me feel calm. "I need you to listen," I said, "to all of it." His voice was so quiet when he answered, "I'm listening." And so, I started. 6 months after we were married, I asked him to come to my fundraiser. It was a big deal for me. I'd planned it for months. Derek said he was too busy with work, and when I told him it was important to me, he threw his phone right at the wall. It just exploded. I remember closing my eyes for a second. He looked at the broken glass all over the floor, then at me, and said, "Look what you made me do." Your grandfather's voice was tight, controlled. "What did you do?" he asked. I told him the truth. I cleaned it up. I apologized. I told myself he was just stressed, that everyone has bad days. Then he asked about the next time. It was easier to talk about with my eyes closed. Without seeing the pain on his face. 3 months later, "I wanted to come visit you for Christmas." Derek insisted we had to be with his mother. I suggested we could split the holidays, Christmas Eve with her and Christmas Day with you. He didn't say anything. He just punched a hole in the wall right next to my head. 6 inches over, and he would have hit me. I could hear the rain starting to fall outside the hospital window. Then I told him about the second year. The things he threw started getting closer. A glass that smashed on the floor near my feet. A plate that hit the counter right beside me. He never actually hit me with them, but they got closer each time. And it was always the same thing he'd say. "Look what you made me do." Your grandfather asked if I'd told anyone. I admitted I told my friend Becca once. She told me to leave him. I got so defensive, told her she didn't understand, that every marriage is hard. I didn't speak to Becca for 3 months after that. Derek loved that, of course. He said she was a bad influence, that she was just jealous of us. He was trying to break us up, he'd say. Your grandfather got up then. He couldn't sit still. He just walked to the window and stared out at the rain, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He asked me, without turning around, what happened in year 3, so I told him. He twisted my wrist once during an argument, bent it back until I heard a pop. He said it was an accident, that he didn't know his own strength. I had to wear a brace for 2 weeks, told everyone I fell down the stairs. I even told the doctor that. That's when I found out I was pregnant with you, he said, so softly. And you thought a baby would make things better. I told him I thought it might calm Derek down, give him something else to focus on. I even laughed. A sad little sound. "I wasn't stupid, Dad," I said. "I knew I was being stupid. Does that make any sense?" And he just said, "Yes, it makes perfect sense." Then it all came pouring out. All the excuses I'd made for every thrown plate, every hole in the wall, every time his grip was too tight or his words cut too deep. I had a reason for all of it. Work stress. It was always my fault, you see, or so I was told. The pressure from his family was one thing, but he made sure I knew I wasn't good enough, not thin enough, not quiet enough. And when I got pregnant, oh, that made everything 1,000 times worse. He loathed that I was growing, that I was always tired. He couldn't stand that I couldn't drink at his work, dinners, or squeeze into the dresses he picked out. He'd say I was letting myself go, that I was an embarrassment. Your grandpa asked if he'd ever hit me before that night. Not a punch, I told him, but he'd grab me, push me. He'd squeeze my arms so hard they'd bruise, and I got so good at covering them up. I remember whispering to your grandpa, last month, he shoved me into the kitchen counter. I hit it so hard, I couldn't catch my breath. I told my doctor I'd tripped over the cat. We never even had a cat. I'll never forget the look on your grandpa's face then. He turned from the window, and while tears were streaming down his face, he wasn't just sad. It was a look I'd never seen before. Honey, cold and hard and final. I should have seen it, he said. But Derek had cut me off from everyone so cleverly. Every time I tried to see him, Derek would invent a business trip or a dinner party. There was always a reason I couldn't get away. Your grandpa asked me when we'd last had lunch, just us. I had to think for a long time. It had been before the wedding, 3 whole years ago. He just closed his eyes when I said that. 3 years. He felt he'd let me live in a nightmare for 3 years without even knowing it. He was so wrapped up in his own world, he said, that he missed every single sign. The lunches I'd cancel, the long sleeves I wore, in July, the way I'd flinch when Derek touched me. It was so subtle, you know? You'd have to be watching closely, and he just wasn't. He said, I'm going to fix this, baby girl. I promise you that. I remember thinking, how? The man's a billionaire. He has an army of lawyers and public relations people. But your grandpa just sat down, took my hand, and said, and I have $800 million and 30 years of connections in this city. I know every person who matters in his world. His voice was so calm, honey, the voice of a man who had built an empire from nothing, who climbed his way out of a tiny apartment and understood exactly how power worked. And just like that, within 2 hours, your grandpa's guest house turned into a command center. I've never seen anything like it. Papers were everywhere, phones were charging, and there were coffee cups nobody even remembered making. The first to arrive was Diane Sullivan, his chief investment officer. She was this incredible woman who could crunch numbers in her head faster than anyone I knew. She walked in holding this leather portfolio like she was born for this moment, looking like she'd already done hours of research before her first cup of coffee. She laid out Derek's whole financial life on the table, things you could find publicly, and, somehow, a few things you couldn't. When your grandpa asked how she got the private stuff, she just smiled this smile that could cut glass and said, I have my sources. She explained that Derek was worth about $2.3 billion, but most of it was in his company, Ashford Innovations. She went on, swiping through screens on her tablet. The interesting part, she said, is that his company went public 3 years ago. Now, I didn't know much about business, but she explained it meant he had to answer to a board and to shareholders. If his stock price fell, he could lose everything. I was sitting on the couch, and I remember asking, what would make the stock drop? It was the first time I felt like I was part of the fight. Diane looked right at me and said that a scandal, loss of investor trust, or criminal charges would do it. Then she told your grandpa about a man inside Derek's company, Gregory Whitman. He'd been Derek's business manager for 10 years and knew where all the skeletons were buried. But he was terrified. They had people watching him. Your grandpa didn't even hesitate. Set up a meeting, he said. Off the record, somewhere safe. He knew the man wouldn't come easily, especially after we learned they'd even followed his daughter to school. So we knew we had to offer him something big. Protection, security for his family, whatever it took. Then Marcus Webb showed up. He was the journalist, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days, with dark circles under his eyes. He sat right down and said he'd been working on a story about Derek for 6 months. Corporate fraud, embezzlement, all of it. He had bits and pieces, but never enough to go public with, until me. He opened his laptop and told us he'd found 6 other women Derek had dated. 4 wouldn't talk, and 1 had even left the country. But there was one, Jennifer Torres. Derek had broken her wrist 5 years ago and paid her $500,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear. She was living under a new name 2 states away. I remember asking him, "Can you find her?" He said he already knew where she was. The hard part was getting her to talk. She was scared, you know. She'd built a whole new life. I looked him right in the eye and said quietly, "Tell her if she doesn't talk, there will be more victims. Tell her to look at the video. Tell her to look at my belly and his hands on my throat, and then ask her if she can live with saying nothing." He just nodded. The last person to arrive that afternoon was our final piece of the puzzle. Her name was Catherine Mills, a divorce attorney around 55 years old. In legal circles, they called her the executioner. She was famous for taking down abusive men in court and had a perfect record to back it up. 12 wins, 0 losses in cases like mine. She sat down, looked at everything we had, and immediately laid out our timeline. It was the ticking clock of my pregnancy. She looked at all of us and said, "Listen to me carefully. Tori is due in 4 weeks. We have to file for emergency custody before that baby is born." She explained that once the baby arrived, Derek could file for access, and a judge might even grant him temporary custody while things were sorted out. We just couldn't let that happen. She told me she'd pulled some strings to get us a judge, Patricia Brennan, who had a zero-tolerance policy for domestic violence, but was also incredibly fair. We needed ironclad proof. 4 weeks, Tori, she said. That's all we have. And for the first time since that horrible night, I felt this tiny flicker of something that felt like hope. I had a team, a plan, a real chance. But I'd learned over the years that hope was a dangerous thing, honey. It makes you lower your guard. Derek's response came just 48 hours later, and it was brutal. First, my medical records, completely fabricated ones, leaked to gossip sites, claiming I had emotional instability and suicidal thoughts. Some psychologist I'd never met went on a morning show talking about my risk for postpartum psychosis. Then he froze every single one of our bank accounts. I remember opening my banking app, my hands shaking, and seeing my personal balance, $300. That was all I had. The hashtag gold digger started trending all over the world. Thousands of people who didn't know me were calling me a liar, a manipulator, a gold digger. Then someone sent a picture to my phone. It was a surveillance photo of me leaving my doctor's office. It had been taken from across the street. Underneath it was a message. "We are watching you. Come home." But the worst blow came when his lawyers sent a letter to my doctor, threatening to sue her practice for releasing patient information. They demanded she take back her report about my injuries, even suggesting that maybe I had done it to myself. I remember Diane calling your grandpa that evening. Her voice was just flat. Gregory Whitman, the man from inside Derek's company, had backed out. Derek's people had gotten to him. They'd followed his daughter again, and his wife threatened to leave him. He was too scared. Your grandpa hung up the phone and just stood in his study, staring at the wall. Then he called Catherine. "They are targeting everyone," he said. "Everyone who helps her becomes a target." And Catherine's voice was so steady when she replied, "That's how abusers operate. They isolate, They threaten. Back in my room, I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. That tiny bit of hope I'd felt was gone, snuffed out like a candle in a storm. You know, honey, there was this one night, around 2 in the morning, when I called your grandpa. I just couldn't stand being in the guest house alone. Of course, he told me to come right over. It was such a short walk, but that night it felt like miles. It was cold and clear, stars everywhere. I could hear the city sounds in the distance, but I just had this feeling, this awful feeling of being watched. I started walking faster. We were just 26 days away from your arrival, but those days felt like a blur of fear. I'd stopped going out at all. There were always news vans at the gate, reporters yelling questions, photographers hiding in the bushes. Someone even left a dead rat on the doorstep with a note. Your grandpa found it first, thank goodness. He threw it away and didn't say a word, but I saw his hands shaking. After that, I pretty much just stayed in the nursery. Your grandpa had set it up for me in the guest house. I painted the walls a soft, sunny yellow. I spent my days organizing all your tiny clothes by size and color. I must have folded and refolded your baby blankets 100 times, just to get the edges perfect. I even built your crib myself. Can you believe it? 8.5 months pregnant, barely able to reach the screws. It just felt like the only thing I could do that mattered. Your Auntie Becca found me one afternoon, just sitting on the floor, surrounded by piles of your little socks. She had takeout with her, and this worried look on her face. I was holding up 2 pairs, one with pink trim, the other with pink polka dots. To me, they were completely different and couldn't be mixed. She told me I'd been at it for 2 hours. I need them to be right, I told her. She just set the food down, sat on the floor with me, and gently took the socks from my hands. Talk to me, she said. Really. I tried to just grab another drawer to sort, but she stopped my hand. I'm fine, I said. I just need to have control over something. But then my voice cracked, and it all just came pouring out. The news reports calling me crazy, the threats from his lawyers, his mother on television every day, and that awful rat on the doorstep. And I just couldn't stop organizing those silly socks. It wasn't pretty crying, honey. It was that deep, ugly kind of crying, the kind that feels like you're drowning. Becca just pulled me into a hug and held me. You are not fine, she said, and that is okay. I told her I had to be strong for you, for my dad. But she said, being strong isn't about not breaking down. It's about breaking down and then getting back up. Let yourself fall apart for a minute, she whispered. I've got you. I just sobbed on her shoulder. All the fear and anger I'd been holding in for weeks finally came out. I cried for the life I thought I'd have, for the man I thought he was, and for the woman I used to be. When it was all over, I felt hollowed out, but lighter. That night, around 3 in the morning, I couldn't sleep. You were doing flips in my belly. I walked into the nursery and just sat in the rocking chair in the moonlight. I looked at the little world I'd made for you, the crib, the books I couldn't wait to read to you. I had always imagined he would be there with us, that holding you would finally make him the man I hoped he could be. I remember putting my hand on my belly and whispering, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry I chose him. You gave a little kick right after I said that. I picked up a tiny onesie with yellow ducks on it and just folded it, then unfolded it, over and over. I used to run marathons. Did you know that? I whispered to you. I was training for my 4th when I met your father. He was so charming, everyone was drawn to him. But he told me marathons were a waste of time, that I should focus on our future. So I stopped. I gave my running shoes away. I thought that was what love required. Then I picked up your tiny socks. I used to have so many friends, lunch dates, book clubs. He convinced me they were a bad influence, that they were jealous. One by one, I let them all go until only Becca was left. And I almost lost her, too. It was the same with my opinions on politics or charity, or even where to go for dinner. He told me my opinions made me sound stupid, that I embarrassed him. So I stopped having them. I just started agreeing with everything he said. I realized then, sitting in the dark, that I was crying again, silent tears. I used to be someone, baby girl. I was Victoria Caldwell. I was capable and strong. And then I became Mrs. Derek Ashford, and I forgot all about Victoria. A memory of your grandma came to me then, from her last days in the hospital. Her hand was so frail, but her eyes were still so fierce. She made me promise her, never let anyone make you small. The world will try. Take up space. Use your voice. Be big and loud. I'd promised her I would, but I had broken that promise. I had let him make me shrink until I almost disappeared. I'd made myself so small, there was almost nothing left of me. I pushed myself out of the rocking chair, went to the window, and watched the rain fall. My own reflection looked back, all tired eyes and fading marks on my throat, with a belly that felt impossibly full with you. But I was there, still breathing. I whispered to your grandmother's memory, I broke my promise, but I can fix this. I can be big again for us. The clock said 22 days, and a tiny idea started to grow. Something wild and new that no one had suggested. Something I would do all by myself. I couldn't get any sleep. I remember lying awake at 4 in the morning, just scrolling on my phone, while you kicked and turned inside me. I kept thinking about what Diane had said offhand, that Gregory Whitman had mentioned your father had a mistress. A model, he'd said, living downtown in a fancy apartment on company money, showered with expensive gifts. So, I opened up Instagram. I looked up your father's public profile, which was all so perfect and clean. Charity events, conferences, him in his shiny office. Nothing seemed wrong. I even checked the pictures he was tagged in. I went through his followers, but nothing stood out. Then it hit me. Your father always carried a second phone. He kept it locked away in his office safe. I'd seen him on it late at night when he thought I was asleep. I never brought it up, of course. You learned quickly not to ask him questions he didn't want to answer. Just then my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't know. My heart just about stopped. I answered it, and this older woman's voice, shaky and scared, whispered, "Check his second account. The username has DA and some numbers." Then she hung up before I could say a thing. I just sat there, holding my phone. I didn't recognize the caller, but her voice felt familiar, like someone I might have heard on TV or in a big crowd. I started searching online. DA2019, DA private, DA8834. I went through so many accounts, and then there it was, a private page with only 3 followers. One of them was a model, a young woman named Amber Collins. I went to her public page. She was 26 and beautiful in that way models are, all sharp angles and knowing how to pose for the camera. She lived in a gorgeous apartment downtown. Her posts were full of pricey gifts, designer handbags, ski trips to Aspen, dinners at places where one plate of food cost more than I had in the bank. All from your father, all of it paid for with company funds. I didn't breathe a word of my plan to anyone, not my dad, not Catherine, not Becca. I sent Amber a private message. My name is Victoria for Ashford. I'm Derek's wife. I'm not angry with you, but I need to talk. It's for your own safety. 2 whole days went by. I was glued to my phone, sure she'd either ignore me or, even worse, tell your father. Then I got a message back. Just one word. Where? We decided on a small cafe about 15 miles out of town. I wore a baseball cap and sunglasses, feeling like I was in some cheap spy movie. But I also felt something else, something I hadn't felt in so long: control. I was finally doing something instead of just waiting for someone else to rescue me. I was taking matters into my own hands. Amber was already sitting at a table when I got there. She seemed smaller than she did in her pictures, and thinner. Her makeup was flawless, but her eyes were guarded, ready for a fight, the way a person's are when they're expecting to be attacked. "You're just some jealous wife trying to ruin his life," she said, before I could even pull out my chair. I didn't say anything back. I just sat down, took out my phone, and played the video from the gala, placing it on the table between us. I didn't have to explain a thing. Amber just watched as your father's hands tightened around my throat, as I struggled. As my body went limp, she saw the waiters pull him away, saw me collapse onto the marble floor. The clip ended, and she hadn't budged. "He did this to me," I said, my voice quiet. "He'll do it to you. It's just a matter of when." "Has he started checking your phone? Telling you which of your friends are bad for you? Criticizing what you wear? Has he ever said, 'Look what you made me do'?" Her whole face changed. I saw it flicker, that flash of recognition, of fear, the start of understanding. She stood up without a word and just walked out. I stayed there for a while by myself, sipping my tea, feeling you kick. I remember wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. But I hadn't. 2 weeks later, when your father started going through Amber's phone, questioning her every move, criticizing her friends and telling her that her career was a joke, she would call me. And she would have the financial records, every single dollar he'd spent on her from the company, every receipt and wire transfer. It was the proof Gregory had been too afraid to give us. But that was still 2 weeks off. At that moment, the clock showed 20 days left, and I had more things to handle. While I was tracking down Amber, James and Diane were focusing on Gregory. Diane set up another meeting, this time at a diner 60 miles away where no one would know them. Gregory showed up looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. "They threatened my girls, James. Someone followed my oldest home from school again. A black car just parked there for 2 hours. My wife is beside herself. She wants to move." "I'll get security for your family," James told him. "A private detail, 24/7, for as long as it takes. I'll cover all of it." "You don't get it," Gregory said. "Derek doesn't just make threats. He acts on them." "So do I," Diane cut in, sliding a folder across the table. "Gregory, listen to me. The SEC is already looking into this. They've had their eye on Ashford Innovations for months because the numbers don't add up. They'll find the offshore accounts eventually, with or without you, and when they do, you'll be part of it. You manage those accounts, you sign the papers, your name is on everything." I heard Gregory's face went completely pale. "You can help us now," Diane went on, "and get immunity, be on the right side of this. Or you can wait, and you can go down with him." Gregory just stared at that folder, his hands trembling so much the coffee in his cup was shaking. 3 days after that, he met James in a parking garage on the other side of town. He kept looking over his shoulder, completely spooked, and handed James a USB drive. It all started with a man named Gregory, bless his heart. He'd found $200 million worth of Derek's dirty laundry, account numbers, wire transfers, emails where your father wasn't even trying to hide it. I remember Gregory's eyes were bloodshot. He told me, "I have 2 daughters. I can't look at them knowing I'm helping a monster." His hands shook so badly when he left. The clock said 18 days. Catherine Mills, my lawyer, she sent a subpoena for my medical records. It was just legal paperwork, you know. But Derek's lawyers sent Dr. Hoffman a letter threatening to ruin her if she complied. The doctor's own lawyer was clear. The court order was what mattered, but it would cost her. They'd drag her name through the mud, try to take her license. She sat all alone in her office that night, with my life in a file on her desk. And in that file, honey, was everything. 3 years of my life documented in injuries, pictures she'd taken, notes about bruises that never quite matched the silly excuses I'd give. She'd noticed how I'd flinch if she touched my arm, how my heart would race, not because I was scared of doctors, but because I was living in a constant state of fear. So she picked up her pen, her hand shaking just a little, and she signed the form. The very next day, my entire medical history went to the court. The real story. Every picture, every note, right down to the bruises on my neck from the time he almost killed me. The clock read 15 days. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb went looking for ghosts. He found a woman named Jennifer Torres, 2 states away, living under a new name. She was a teacher, had a little house with a garden. She'd built a whole new life from the wreckage your father left behind. The first time Marcus knocked, she barely opened the door. She told him, "I signed an NDA. I can't talk." $500,000. That's what he'd paid for her silence. Marcus told her Derek was still at it, that he'd hurt me on camera while I was pregnant. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice when Marcus told me about it later. She just said, "Help me stop him." But she was terrified. "I'll lose the money," she'd said. "He'll sue me. You don't know what he's like." So Marcus left, but he couldn't forget the look in her eyes. He went back a week later. This time he brought pictures from the video. Big glossy photos of me, pregnant, with Derek's hands on my throat. Jennifer opened the door. She just stared at those photos, her own hands starting to tremble. "She's pregnant," she whispered. 8 months. And then she told him, "He did the same thing to me. I thought I was going to die. He broke my wrist when I fought back, then drove me to the hospital and said I fell off a horse." Who falls off a horse in Manhattan? It was such a Derek lie. Jennifer sat right down on her porch steps and decided, "I'll break the NDA. I don't care about the money. And I want you to use my real name. I'm done hiding." The clock now said 12 days. Back home, Derek's lawyers were trying to get custody of you before you were even born. They had 3 psychiatrists, people who'd never even met me, diagnose me with all sorts of things based on lies Derek fed them. At the same time, he held a big press conference, donating a ton of money to a children's cancer charity. He stood up there with tears in his eyes, looking like a hero. He talked about our struggles and moving forward with compassion. He kept saying "my wife" as if he hadn't just tried to murder me. And you know, some people started to believe him. The internet was flooded with comments. "Maybe she is unstable. He seems so genuine." Catherine called a meeting right away. "He's rewriting reality," she said, "and it's working. We have to move now." But here's the thing that kept me up at night. To win, I'd have to testify. I'd have to sit there, just 10 feet from him, and tell the whole world what he did to me. The thought of it made me physically sick. Becca had to hold my hair back while I threw up. I remember saying, "I can't do this," my cheek against the cold bathroom floor. She said, "You can. You've survived worse." But had I? Later that night, after everyone was asleep, I did something completely on my own. I opened a recording app on my phone, and I called Derek. My hands were shaking so much, but I dialed his number, put the phone to my ear, and waited. He answered right away, and just like that, his voice changed. It was that smooth, charming voice he used on investors. The one that fooled everybody. "Victoria," he said, "I'm glad you called. I've been worried." He started talking about me coming home, about our family being together. It was all a performance, but I was ready. I'd practiced this conversation 100 times in my head. I knew exactly how to make him feel superior, how to get him to brag. "But if I come back, I asked. What happens to the people who helped me? My dad? My lawyer? And that's when his mask slipped. Just for a second, but it was enough. Your father is going to regret this, he snarled. I'll bury him. Catherine Mills will never work again. And that reporter, Marcus Webb? Everyone who crossed me is going to pay. What about Gregory, Ice? I asked. Gregory, he said, is a dead man walking. He thinks he can hide? He laughed. I know where his daughters go to school. Lincoln Elementary. 3rd and 5th grade. I know their names. My hands were trembling, but I kept my voice perfectly calm. It was the performance of my life. Okay, I said. I understand. So, you'll come home? He asked. I'll think about it, I said, and I hung up. I saved the recording and just sat there in the dark, breathing. Then I sent the file to Catherine with one line. He threatened Gregory's children. She called me back in less than a minute. Where did you get this? She whispered. I called him. I recorded it. There was just silence. Then Catherine said, so slowly, Tori, this is witness intimidation, threatening children. This is a crime, in his own voice. Good, I said. I had done it myself. I had used the one thing he never saw coming, my willingness to hear his voice, his threats, just one more time. I was willing to walk back into that fire, to bring out the proof that would finally burn him down. The clock read 10 days. At 9 that night, Marcus Webb's article went live online. The headline was something like, The Real Derek Ashford, A Pattern of Violence and Crime. It was 6 months of work, 12,000 words that just laid everything bare. 4 of his ex-girlfriends, all telling the same story. The charm, the isolation, the control, the violence. Jennifer Torres was quoted all through it. She described the night he broke her wrist, the sound it made, the way he stood over her. She talked about the drive to the hospital, where he told the doctor she fell off a horse. She mentioned the $500,000 check he wrote the next morning, as casually as if he were paying for a coffee, and the NDA his lawyers made her sign. I signed it because I was terrified, she said. And I knew exactly what she meant. He'd threatened to ruin me if I ever spoke a word, you know. So for 5 years, I just buried it all, pretending it never happened. But it did. And the thought that he was doing it to others, that's what I couldn't bear. The article brought out stories from 3 other employees who saw his violence firsthand. One remembered him throwing a laptop at an intern's head. Another assistant was so terrorized by his screaming, she just walked out and later filed for disability. It was always behind closed doors, the broken furniture, the staff just huddled in fear. And then there was Gregory's evidence, all the financials laid out for the world to see, offshore accounts, wire transfers of over $200 million, emails where Derek talked about hiding money. The article even had photos from the Gala security tape, his hands on my throat, my baby bump so obvious. The look on my face. I still can't see it. I remember reading what Gregory said. I worked for Derek Ashford for 10 years. I watched him become a monster. I watched him hurt people and pay them off. I watched him steal from his own company, and I did nothing because I was afraid. But I'm not afraid anymore. The truth needs to be told. I'll never forget how fast it all happened. Within an hour, that story was shared 10,000 times. Then his company issued a denial, threatening to sue everyone. A few hours later, 2 more women came forward. By midnight, the company's stock had plunged 15%. He left me a voicemail, of course. I just let it record. That article is full of lies. I will sue that reporter into poverty. I will take our daughter, and you will never see her again. I saved it. It was just more proof. Every word he spoke was just him digging his own grave, but he was too full of himself to see it. The custody hearing started just 8 days before you were due. 3 days in that courtroom felt like a lifetime. On the first day, Catherine laid out all the evidence. There were Dr. Hoffman's medical records, 3 years of injuries I'd tried to explain away, photos of bruises on my arms, my ribs, notes about how I'd flinch if someone moved too fast, and then the proof of the bruising on my neck from the Gala. 17 people from that night gave statements, all describing what they saw. A few of them even mentioned how much he'd been drinking, that he'd been making threats about me earlier in the evening. They played the security footage on a huge screen. No sound, just him coming after me. His hands finding my throat, my body just giving out before the waiters pulled him off. Gregory Whitman walked them through the finances, all the statements and emails. $200 million just gone. Then Jennifer Torres got on the stand. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking. She talked about her broken wrist, the NDA, the money, the 5 years of shame. And then Catherine played the recording. It was Derek's voice, threatening my father, my lawyer, Marcus Webb, even Gregory's children. The whole courtroom just went silent. Even his own lawyers just stopped writing. The second day was his defense. It was a joke, really. 3 psychiatrists who'd never even met me were dismissed almost immediately by the judge. I remember her saying, "Unless you have personally evaluated Mrs. Ashford, I am not interested in your speculation." Then his mother, Margaret, took the stand, all dressed in black and pearls, trying to look like a grieving mother. She called me difficult, manipulative. That's when Catherine played Margaret's own video from her phone, the one she took while her son was strangling me. You could see the camera shake a little as she filmed it all. "You recorded your son attempting to murder his wife," Catherine said, her voice so calm. "And you did nothing. You didn't call for help. You didn't try to stop him. You just kept filming." Margaret whispered something about being in shock. "Or perhaps," Catherine said, "you were gathering footage to use against Victoria later." And just like that, Margaret fell apart. She had nothing to say. That was day 3. The judge, Judge Brennan, reviewed everything. I'll never forget her words. "The evidence presented by Mrs. Ashford's legal team is overwhelming and deeply disturbing," she said. "Multiple witnesses testified to a consistent pattern of violent, controlling, and abusive behavior." She said the medical evidence confirmed years of abuse, that the video showed a clear attempt on my life while I was 8 months pregnant. Then she looked right at Derek. "Mr. Ashford, I find your defense to be insulting to this court's intelligence. You attempted to murder your wife in front of hundreds of witnesses. You then used your wealth to launch a smear campaign against the victim, and you stood in my courtroom today and continued to lie." She turned to me then. "Mrs. Ashford, I am granting your petition in full. You will have sole legal and physical custody of your daughter upon her birth. Mr. Ashford will be allowed supervised visitation only, just 1 hour a month, in a secure building with a court supervisor, and an emergency protective order, too. He wasn't allowed within 500 feet of me, any violation, and he'd be arrested immediately." Her last words were for him. "I am also referring this case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. What you did to your wife was attempted murder. You should be in jail." The gavel fell, and I just collapsed. I sobbed so hard into Catherine's arms, I could barely breathe. My dad hugged us both so tightly it almost hurt. Becca was crying. Even Catherine had tears in her eyes. It was finally over. You were safe. We had made it, with just 3 days to spare. 2 days later, at 3:17 in the morning, I woke up to a contraction that just stole my breath. I lay there for 10 minutes, timing them. 5 minutes apart, then 4, then 3. This was it. This was real. I called my dad. He answered on the first ring. I don't think he'd really slept since the gala. "Dad," I said, "I think it's time." He just said, "I'm coming right now. Don't move." 10 minutes later, he was there with the hospital bag we'd packed weeks before. We thought we had everything planned, everything ready, but you can't plan for something like this. Dr. Hoffman was waiting for us at the hospital. She told me I was already at 7 centimeters. "You were in a hurry to get here." They moved me to a delivery room, and Dad held my hand through every contraction. Becca rushed in about 20 minutes later, all out of breath. The epidural was helping, and things were moving so fast. But at 9 centimeters, I saw the look on Dr. Hoffman's face change. She called for more nurses, and I heard her whisper to the anesthesiologist. I only caught a few words, but they were the ones that mattered. The bruising from the strangulation was causing complications. I was hemorrhaging. After that, honey, everything was a blur. The room filled up with people, and the monitors started making a different kind of sound, faster and more urgent. Dr. Hoffman made the call in less than 30 seconds. "We need an emergency C-section now." The world was spinning. I felt hands lifting me, the cold air of the operating room. I just reached out, trying to find my dad's hand. "Is the baby okay, Dad? Is the baby okay?" He kept saying, "The baby is fine. You're going to be fine. I'm right here." And then you were born, at 4:22 in the morning, so tiny and pink, and screaming your little lungs out, with no idea about the chaos you just entered. But I wasn't fine. I had lost so much blood. Dr. Hoffman was working so fast, calling for transfusions. My vision started to go. The last thing I saw before I passed out was your grandpa holding you. His face was just this wreck of pure joy and absolute terror. Tears streaming down his cheeks, holding his brand new granddaughter, while his own daughter was bleeding out on the table. I woke up in the intensive care unit 48 hours later. The room was so dim, with all these machines beeping. My body felt like it didn't belong to me. Every little move was agony. The very first thing I saw was the little bassinet right next to my bed. And there you were, Charlotte, sleeping inside. So tiny, so perfect, and so close. I reached out, my hand shaking, and I was just able to touch your little fingers through the rails. They were the smallest things I'd ever felt, so warm and real. But I couldn't lift you, honey. I was too weak, too broken, with all the tubes and wires connected to me. For the first 2 days of your life, I could only touch you through the bars of that hospital bed. I couldn't hold you, couldn't nurse you, none of the things I had dreamed of. That, my love, was the real price of your father's violence. It wasn't about money or status. It was the first moments of a mother holding her child. And then the second awful thing happened. Catherine Mills came to my room on the third morning, and her face was just stone. "Tori, I have to tell you something." "What is it?" I asked. "Derek's lawyers filed an emergency motion. They went to a different judge," she said, "not Brennan. They're arguing that what happened to me proves I'm not physically fit to take care of a baby. They want temporary custody to go to Margaret Ashford." I just stared at her. I was lying in an ICU bed with drainage tubes in me. I had nearly bled to death. I hadn't even held you in my arms yet. "We have 24 hours to respond," she said. Then the third disaster struck that same day. Gregory Whitman was found beaten unconscious in a parking garage. His laptop, which had copies of all the financial proof, was gone. Someone called in an anonymous tip to the police, saying it was a random mugging, but we all knew what had really happened. Your father might have had a protective order against him, might have been facing charges, but he still had people who would do his dirty work. People who would beat a man into a coma and steal his laptop just because he said so. And there I was, lying in that hospital bed, unable to walk, unable to even hold you. Gregory was in a coma down the hall. A strange judge was deciding if I could keep you, and my own father was just pacing anxiously in the hallway. Your grandpa looked older and more tired than I had ever seen him. Becca brought you to my bedside, and I slipped my fingers through the bars of the bassinet to touch your tiny hand. Your fingers curled around mine, so warm and strong. It changed everything. I won the hearing, I whispered to you, but it didn't feel like it mattered. He'll never stop coming for us. That's when Catherine, my lawyer, said, "Then we don't stop either." She set up her laptop right there on my hospital table. I could barely hold a pen, but she said we would figure it out, and we did. We had 24 hours, and we used every minute. Catherine filed the response from my room, typing as I dictated between waves of pain. Our argument was heartbreakingly simple. Mr. Ashford had strangled me so badly that it caused complications with your delivery, and he was now using those very complications to claim I was an unfit mother. You know, the court shouldn't protect someone who caused so much pain. The new judge, he wanted to hear it all, and he set up a hearing for the very next morning. I asked if I could join by video, right from the ICU, and he said yes. That evening, your grandfather came to my room and shut the door. He told me that through Diane's connections, he'd found out this judge had money tied up with one of Derek's investors. He thought we could use it, get the judge thrown off the case. But I looked at him, then at you, sleeping in your little bassinet, and I just said no. I told him that was Derek's way of doing things, using connections and loopholes. If we did the same, we'd be just like him. Your grandpa said it was about winning, but for me, it was about more than that. I knew one day you'd ask me about this, and I had to be able to tell you I fought the right way, that I didn't become the monster I was fighting. He just looked at me for the longest time. This daughter of his, in a hospital bed, who could barely move. A woman who'd almost left this world, bringing you into it, fighting for you from a hospital bed, while the man who hurt her tried to take you away. He finally just said, "Your mother would be so proud." The hearing was at 9 the next day. I watched on a screen as Derek's lawyers argued I was unfit, that you needed someone stable, like Margaret Ashford. Funny thing was, Derek Troy wasn't even there. His lawyers said he had a scheduling conflict. A scheduling conflict. The man trying to get custody of his own baby couldn't even show up. Then my video feed came on, and they saw me, pale, in that horrible gown, with an IV and tubes everywhere. Behind me were the monitors, beeping away, and right at the edge of the screen, they could see your bassinet. I think the judge saw it all then. A mother who almost died because of the man asking for her child, fighting for her baby, while her husband stayed home and sent his lawyers. I asked if I could speak, and the judge let me. He said, "Your Honor, 3 days ago, I almost died bringing my daughter into this world. I explained how the problems were from when your father had hurt me when I was 8 months pregnant. I had to stop to catch my breath, and the whole room was just still. I told him, I'm talking to you from an ICU bed. I haven't even been able to hold my baby yet. I haven't slept in 3 days, but I am here. I will always be here. That's what a mother does." I pointed out that my husband wasn't there, that he always sent other people to do his dirty work, and that was the real difference between us. I show up. Even when it's hard, even when I'm scared, even when my body feels broken. I show up because my little girl needs me to, and I will never, ever stop showing up for her. The silence after I finished felt like an eternity. The judge looked at Derek's empty chair, then back at me on the screen, this broken woman who refused to be broken. Motion denied, he said. Full custody remains with Victoria Ashford. 3 days after that, a man named Gregory Whitman woke up in a room 2 floors below mine, and the first thing he told the police was this: "Cloud, back up. Everything's on the cloud. The password is my daughter's birthdays." You see, the laptop they stole meant nothing. Gregory had backed up every single file to the cloud long before he even gave that USB drive to your grandfather. Every email, every bank transfer, every secret account, all the proof that Derek had stolen $210 million from his own company. Derek's men got the machine, but they completely missed the information. The SEC had it all, and that, my dear, was the beginning of the end for everything Derek Ashford had built, and the start of rebuilding everything he'd tried to tear down. Those first 2 weeks after you were born, I finally left the hospital. We spent our first night at your grandfather's house, and I just held you for hours. I didn't sleep at all. I just wanted to feel your tiny weight on my chest, your warmth, your little breaths. At the same time, federal agents were raiding Ashford Innovations, taking computers and records, and starting to build their case, a case that would take months to put together, but was clear as day from the start. Derek Ashford was a thief. In those first couple of months, all his offshore accounts were frozen, and the bank records were all pulled. The proof was right there. $210 million siphoned off over 5 years, fake reports and lies to everyone. I actually asked for my old job back at the nonprofit, and they hired me on the spot. I started part-time, of course, because I had you, and I was still healing and putting my life back together one piece at a time. Then, around month 3 or 4, the board had a big meeting. The first vote to get rid of Derek failed. It was 7-5. He tried to convince those 5 to stick with him, promising everything would be fine. But then Diane Sullivan went to work on those same 5 people. She quietly showed each one exactly how much legal trouble they were in if they kept supporting a CEO who was under a federal investigation. She laid out how their own money could be taken, how their names would be ruined, and how their own investors would run for the hills. You know, it all came crashing down with a vote of 10-2. That was the day Derek Summers, and yes, your grandfather, Bay Dre, lost his position as CEO. He was kicked out of the company his own father started, the one he'd grown into a billion-dollar giant. I remember hearing that security walked him out of the building. The employees just watched him go. This man who used to throw laptops and scream at people, walking away for the very last time. Around then, I was made a director at the nonprofit. My first paycheck was so small, but I used it to buy Charlotte's first proper crib for our own little apartment. It was paid for with my own money. In the months that followed, from the 4th to the 6th, they took everything from him. The Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons house, the place in Aspen, the yacht, all those fancy cars, even his $30 million art collection. It was all sold off to pay back what he'd stolen. Creditors swarmed, business partners sued him, and old employees filed lawsuits for how he'd treated them. The legal bills ate up whatever was left. Eventually, even his lawyers gave up on him. He was buried in unpaid bills and what the courts call irreconcilable differences. In the end, a public defender had to take his criminal case. I, on the other hand, had just signed a lease for a small one-bedroom place. It was modest, darling. The kitchen's so tiny you could barely turn around in it. My closet was just a sliver of the huge walk-in I'd had with him. And the view? A brick wall, not some sparkling city skyline. But you know what? Every single thing in that apartment was mine, chosen by me. The blue sofa, Those bright yellow chairs for the kitchen, the bookshelf I filled with picture books for Charlotte. There was a framed photo of my mother on the dresser. It was all mine, and only mine. And then, a woman named Amber Collins called me. She told me everything. Just like I thought, Derek had been tracking her phone calls and texts. He started putting down her friends, her job, how she looked. He even started using that awful phrase, "Look what you made me do." Amber had proof, you see. Records of every cent Derek spent on her using company money. The apartment lease, credit card bills, for gifts, trips, all of it charged to the business. That's when the SEC piled on even more charges for embezzlement and fraud. The case just kept getting bigger and tighter around him, with no way out. It was around that time I first went to a domestic violence support group. I found myself sitting with 15 other women in a church basement. I told them my story, not every detail, but the important parts. I was one of the lucky ones, I told them. My father had the means to fight for me, but most people don't have that. So, what can you do? You have to save yourself, I said. It sounds impossible. I know, when you're so tired and afraid, but you just take one little step. You call a helpline. You tell one person the truth. You hide $1 in an account they don't know about. Just one tiny step toward the door. As I looked at their faces, I saw myself in each one. The door was never locked, I told them softly. I was my own jailer. I stayed because I was terrified, but being scared and free is so much better than being scared and trapped. Then I got a call I never saw coming. It was Margaret Ashford. It was late, and Charlotte was already asleep. I almost didn't pick up. "Victoria, please," she said. "Don't hang up." I asked her what she wanted. She told me the anonymous tip about Derek's secret bank account, that it had been her. I was just silent. I remember slowly sitting down on the edge of my bed. I couldn't stop him out in the open. Margaret's voice trembled. I was too scared, but I knew I could point you where to look. I asked her why she hadn't done more. "Because I was married to a man just like him for 30 years, she confessed. Derek's father had been hitting her for 3 decades. She had gotten used to it, accepted it. She taught her son that this was how men showed love, without ever saying the words. She had taught him that, and by the time she saw the monster she had helped create, it was too late. Margaret was sobbing by then. I raised a monster, I see that now. I'm getting help, therapy. I'm trying to understand." That didn't make what she did right, and I told her so. Filming me, calling me unstable on TV. Nothing excuses it, she agreed. I never forgave her, not really, but in that moment, I understood. Margaret was a glimpse of what I could have become if I'd stayed another 10, 20, or 30 years. A woman so lost in the cycle of abuse that she couldn't see it anymore. Just passed it down like some terrible family heirloom. The supervised visit was on a Tuesday, in a gray building with cameras humming in every corner. The fluorescent lights made a buzzing sound, and a social worker named Linda sat by the door. I was at a little table with Charlotte, who was 4 months old then, on my lap. She was so bright and curious, always reaching for things. When Derek walked in, I hardly knew him. He was so thin, his hair was a mess, and he was wearing a cheap suit that hung off him. His face was hollow, with dark circles under his eyes. He looked a decade older than he had at that gala. He'd already been found guilty, you see. The trial took 2 weeks, but the evidence was just too much. I had to testify. I sat there in the witness chair and told my story just plainly and calmly. I showed them the faint scars on my neck. I looked right at the jury and told them everything I had kept hidden for 3 years, and they believed me. He was guilty on all counts, with sentencing the next week. Derek's eyes went straight to Charlotte. I saw something flicker across his face. Maybe it was grief or regret or just the simple, awful realization of all he'd lost. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice all scratchy. "Can I hold her?" "No. Victoria, please," he begged. "She's my daughter. I just want to hold her for a minute." "You tried to kill her," I told him. "When your hands were on my throat, you were killing us both. You don't get to hold her." His jaw tightened, and I recognized that look, the anger rising, the control breaking. But he couldn't do a thing. Not there. The cameras were on, Linda was watching, and security was right outside. He was completely powerless. "I'm sorry," he said. "For everything. I was under so much pressure. Work, family. I wasn't myself." I had to stop him. My voice was steady when I said, "You don't get to do that." "Do what?" he asked. "Make excuses. Blame things. Pretend you're someone you're not. You are yourself, Derek. The man who threw things, who twisted my arm, who cut me off from my life. The man who tried to strangle me when I was pregnant with your child. That is the real you. I was sick," he tried. "I needed help." "You're not sick," I told him. "You're abusive. There's a difference. Sick people want to get better. They take responsibility. They change. You've done none of that. Even now, you're making excuses." "You destroyed my life," he said. "No," I replied. "You destroyed your own life. Every single thing happening to you is because of the choices you made. Your father spent $800 million to ruin me," he spat. "My father spent $800 million to protect me," I told him. "To protect Charlotte. Because that's what real love looks like. You have no idea what love is, Derek. You think it's about control and possession, but it's not. Love is sacrifice. It's protection. It's putting someone else first." I shifted Charlotte in my lap. She was reaching for a toy on the table, not the least bit interested in the man across from us. "By the time you get out of prison," I said, "Charlotte will be a grown woman. She will know exactly who you are, and she will make her own choice about you. That decision will be hers, not mine, and not yours." Derek suddenly stood up, his chair scraping the floor. Linda moved forward, and I saw the guards get closer. "I can't do this," he muttered, and then he just turned and walked out. The door shut behind him with a sad, empty sound. I walked out of that building into the bright afternoon sun. Becca was there with the car. She asked me how I felt. I thought I would feel happy, or vindicated, or at least satisfied, but I didn't feel any of that. What I felt was lighter, as if a huge weight I'd been carrying for so long, a weight I'd gotten so used to I'd forgotten it was even there, had finally been put down. "I feel nothing," I told her, "and that feels exactly right." A week later, Catherine sent a text. 25 years, attempted murder, embezzlement, witness intimidation, all to be served, one after the other. It was truly over. I didn't go to the sentencing. I was at the park with Charlotte. She was 7 months old by then. Crawling in the grass, grabbing dandelions, and babbling at the birds, I read the text, put my phone away, and pushed her on the swing. She laughed, and that sound was so pure and free, filled with everything that truly mattered. That night, after she was asleep, I sat on the couch in my little apartment and recorded a voice memo, something for her to listen to one day. For when she was old enough to ask about her father, old enough to want the whole truth. "Hi, baby girl," I began. "If you're listening to this, I imagine by the time you're old enough to hear this, you'll be asking questions about me, about your father, about how everything unfolded. So, I want to tell you myself, your father chose to be cruel. It wasn't because of a stressful job or family drama or anything else you could blame. He made a conscious decision to hurt the people he said he loved. That was on him, sweetheart, not on me, and certainly not on you. For 3 long years I stayed, making up stories to explain his behavior, ignoring every warning sign. I honestly believed I could change him, that our love would be enough to fix what was broken. But I learned a hard lesson. Love can't fix someone who doesn't want to be whole. I also learned that needing help is the bravest thing you can do. Your grandpa, Becca, Dr. Hoffman, Catherine, Marcus, Gregory, so many people became my lifeline. I never could have made it out alone, and that's perfectly okay. The moment I stopped needing his approval to save myself, that was the moment I was truly free. You are not defined by his mistakes. His life has absolutely no bearing on the wonderful person you are and will become. You get to decide your own way. I will never let anyone diminish you, and I'll teach you to claim your space, use your voice, and be exactly who you are without apology. That's what your grandmother taught me, and it's what I'm passing on to you. I put down the recorder that day, knowing I'd add to it over time to paint the full picture for you. The simple truth, with no sugarcoating or resentment, just reality and love. Meanwhile, in a cell 500 miles away, Derek Ashford was starting his new life on a metal slab, staring at concrete. The room was tiny, 6 feet by 8 feet, with a humming fluorescent light that never went out. He wore a standard orange jumpsuit. There were no pictures, no mail, and no one ever came to see him. His bank account was empty, his company dissolved, the homes and cars and yacht all gone. The art, the suits, the private jet, his name scraped off the side of a skyscraper, all of it had just vanished. 25 years stretched out before him, a future of concrete, bad food, and buzzing silence. When he shut his eyes, only one memory seemed to stick. That visitation room. You, a tiny 4-month-old on my lap, reaching for a toy, never once looking his way. You didn't know who he was, and didn't care that the stranger at the table was your father. By the time he was a free man model, I had a plan, that when you turned 25, you would finally know it all. You'd see the news clippings, the court documents, you'd even hear those old voice memos from me. You would learn exactly who your biological father was, what he'd done, and then the choice would be entirely yours. In our little one-bedroom apartment then, right at that very moment, you were pulling yourself up on the coffee table. You'd been at it for days, honey, grabbing the edge, getting to your feet for just a second before tumbling down, but you never cried. You just flash that little grin and go right back at it. Our walls were filled with pictures of our family, my mom holding me as a baby, her face just full of that fierce mama bear love. James holding you in the hospital, tears of pure wonder on his face. Your Aunt Becca making silly faces to get a laugh out of you. Even Dr. Hoffman, smiling at your very first checkup. There wasn't a single picture of Derek anywhere. I was on the floor watching you when my phone lit up. A message from Catherine appeared on the screen. Sentencing upheld, 25 years confirmed. It's really over. I remember reading it and just setting the phone face down. I turned my attention back to you, and you grabbed that coffee table again. You pulled yourself up, wobbled for a moment, and then you were standing. You looked right at me and gave me this big, open and utterly fearless smile. And then you took your first step. Your grandpa James, he spent every last cent he had, $800 million, everything he had built from scratch, over 30 years. He used it all to make sure the man who tried to harm you could never hurt anyone again. When people asked if it was worth it, he always said the same thing. That money was never mine. It was always hers. Derek Ashford went to prison with nothing left. No money, no business, no family, no legacy. Just 25 years of concrete walls ahead of him, knowing his daughter would be calling another man's house her home. As for me, I became Victoria Caldwell, again the day the divorce papers were signed. I went back to being the woman I was before, the one who ran marathons and had strong opinions, the one who wasn't afraid to take up space. I promised myself I would never let anyone make me feel small again, and I was going to make sure you never did either. That whole chapter of our lives, well, it was a difficult one, but every single part of it shaped the story I'm telling you now. The reason I'm telling you all this, my dear, is because our stories hold our most valuable lessons. Every family has them, these memories that are meant to inspire you, to empower you. I've always believed that our experiences, even the painful ones, are what truly shape us. And sharing them, well, that's how we keep those lessons alive. So thank you, my love, for letting me share ours with you. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.